The following video may contain offensive content. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Dalton, and finally I'm reviewing Solo, a Star Wars story. I apologize that this video is a little late. I actually saw it on the Thursday showing. I dressed up and everything. I was dressed up as Han Solo, and it turns out I was the only jackass in the place with a costume on. However, I did get a lot of compliments, so I guess it was worth it in that respect. So I went to see the movie with my buddy Ethan. He's a big Star Wars fan too, and he would be here, but unfortunately he's not. However, if I could plug my own YouTube channel for just a moment, I'm doing a parody video of the official teaser that Star Wars released for Solo, a Star Wars story. He's in it, I'm in it, along with my friend Alex. I've been pulling a lot of all-nighters and editing a lot, so I hope you guys like it. Since I'm a little late with the review, I figured I'd at least give you that so you have something to look forward to. Obviously, there's going to be spoilers in this video. If you haven't seen Solo yet, I wouldn't watch unless you just don't care. That's your warning. With that being said, let's get started. I think a fitting place to start is with Han, of course. I think Alden Ehrenreich totally nailed Han Solo. There were often times that I couldn't believe how good of a performance he was doing as a young Han Solo. It was completely believable. There were several times where he pulled off that suave, cocky charisma that Han Solo is famous for, and I can honestly say, when he pulled it off, I couldn't help but smirk. I just sat there smiling like a jackass because I was like, damn it, that's Han Solo. Great job, kid. Probably the first time that I felt like that was where he goes up to the customs agent, the Imperial Guard, and she asks for their boarding passes or identification. And he was like, about that, we don't have them. But what we do have is this. And the way that he sort of talked his way through that and was bribing an Imperial officer, that was one of the prime examples of Han Solo being Han Solo, and I thought he nailed it then. So in other words, I thought the casting was great for Han. People have been complaining about Alden Ehrenreich being Han Solo. From the get-go, people were pissed that basically Harrison Ford wasn't Han Solo. I know that a lot of people were really rooting for Anthony Ingruber, I think that's his name, to be the young Han Solo in this film, and that's basically because Ingruber was a young Harrison Ford in some movie I've never seen, plus he did some sort of imitation of Han in the cantina scene, and it's a YouTube video that's pretty popular. So I've seen a lot where people were like, to hell with Alden Ehrenreich, I don't like him, they should have cast Anthony Ingruber. I really think you should trust the casting department because Alden Ehrenreich did a fantastic job. Not only that, I want to say that it was Ron Howard in an interview said something along the lines of, being Han Solo is more than just doing a good impression of Harrison Ford. And I think that basically wraps it up. I really liked the introduction of the movie where Han was sort of doing these heists on Corellia. The Lady Proxima thing I thought was sort of interesting, that she's sort of like this gang lord in a way. That was one thing. I figured they wouldn't have the scrolling text like in the trilogy movies because Rogue One didn't. So when the blue paragraph text came up explaining the background of Lady Proxima, I was so sort of wrapped up in the fact that the movie had started that I was like skimming it. I wasn't reading it completely. Even so, I think I would have liked to learn a little bit more about what was going on with that Lady Proxima, the big worm lady. It's very reminiscent of what Gareth Shrike did with Han in the novel The Paradise Snare, which is of course Legends now. Great series of novels. I highly recommend them. I'm like halfway through the second one. Forgive me, I'll be referencing some of those novels just because that was the original Han Solo origin story. But basically what Gareth Shrike would do, he would get all these orphan kids and have them rob like all these rich people on the streets and give it to Gareth Shrike, who was basically Lady Proxima in the novel. Han comes back and he doesn't have exactly what she was hoping for, and he's trying to talk his way through it, and he realizes he can't, and he does that bit with the rock, and he's like, this is a thermal detonator. And she's like, no it isn't, you're just holding a rock and you made a click sound with your mouth. And then he throws it through the glass, and then it reveals that they have an aversion to sunlight. Also in the same scene, we see Han and Qi'ra's relationship. What I thought was gonna happen was that they were childhood friends, and then their like romantic relationship would bloom throughout the movie. But as soon as Han gets back to that little lair they were in, they just start sucking face. I was like, oh, okay. I didn't have a problem with it. They're young, they're in love, and their passions are very strong. And it's like that puppy dog phase to the point where they just can't get enough of each other. Han in that scene sort of reminded me of like a 50s greaser. He had his hot rod, he had his girl, and he's like, baby, we're gonna put this town in our rear view mirror, except for, you know, instead of putting the town in the rear view mirror, they were gonna escape the planet. Something I'm a little disappointed about, and it's seriously the most minor complaint possible. I was really hoping that that was like his personal ride, like his pride and joy, like his hot rod. But the fact that he just sort of stole it in the scene beforehand kind of made me disappointed, because I wanted that to be Han's vehicle, his personal car. And it's just something that I formulated in my own head. It shouldn't even be a complaint. So of course, Han and Qi'ra are trying to escape and things don't go as planned. He gets through, but she doesn't. He's like, I'll come back for you. And that was another thing. He didn't know what to do, so he was like, well, I guess I'll enlist in the Empire. I'll join the Imperial Navy. I thought that was maybe a stretch, but I guess if you look at it from his point of view, there were no other options and he didn't know what to do. Something that I didn't really care for with that scene, when he approaches the recruiter, they ask him his name, he says Han, and then he says something along the lines of, you got a last name? Who are your people? And he says, I have no people. I didn't really like that that was the origins of his name. If we're going to jump back to Legends, Han was an orphan and he went by various aliases throughout his life, but he knew his name was at least Han, and then he learns that his last name is Solo, that was his true name, so he starts going by it eventually. But in this, some random recruiter gives him the last name Solo. Sort of a minor thing, but I didn't particularly care for that. That brings us to the 3 years later scene where Han is in the trenches of battle fighting for the Empire. His stint in the Imperial Navy didn't really work out for him, and now he's basically a grunt. They introduced the new Mud Troopers, which I thought was interesting. You've always seen the enlisted troopers in some sort of stormtrooper armor, but Han and the rest of them had their face exposed. It was probably mostly just an excuse to show Han and Beckett and everybody else to be able to see their face during the battle. That battle was really intense, and I love that it just cuts 3 years later and he's in the trenches. That was sort of reality knocking him in the face. He thought he was gonna get in the Navy, learn to fly, go back to Corellia, get Qi'ra, and he'd be fine. And 3 years later, he's fighting a war that he wants nothing to do with. That scene was badass. It was really grimy and dingy and dirty. When I first heard about Rogue One, that's basically what I wanted it to be. I wanted Rogue One to be Saving Private Ryan set in Star Wars. That's what I wanted from Rogue One. We get our introduction to Beckett and his crew. Han calls him out and he's like, hey, you guys aren't troopers. You're doing something else. Han's like, take me with you, and Beckett doesn't want him, so then Han tries to blackmail him. I think maybe that was an example of the fact that he's still young and he hasn't quite mastered his art of smooth talking, so it sort of backfired on him, and then they're like, throw him in with the creature or whatever they called it, I forget. And then that was the introduction to Chewie. The fact that Han was speaking Shriwook and going like really poorly, that was a little more comedy. Chewie looked pretty vicious with all the mud in his fur and everything. I didn't like that they sort of portrayed Chewie as a monster. Of course, we all know that Chewie isn't a monster, but the idea of Chewie eating people to survive is something that's kind of morbid. I mean, I guess it's morbid in the first place that they have him chained up solely for that purpose. But I think I like Han and Chewie's introduction in Legends a little better. In Legends, Han was actually in the Imperial Academy, and it was the only thing he really cared about at the time. Chewie was basically enslaved, and Han saved Chewie from enslavement. Han got kicked out of the Imperial Academy for saving Chewie. Han's down on his luck and he's drinking, and then Chewie approaches him one night in a drunken stupor. Chewie said to him, I owe you a life debt. I'm not leaving you. I owe you my life, so I'm gonna help you in any way possible. And at first, Han was not willing to accept that. Han was like, I don't want this big furry oaf following me around. So I thought that was a really cool explanation in the Hutt Gambit, which of course is Legends now. But in this, it still had sort of that dynamic, because Chewie was gonna kill Han, but then they end up working together to smash out that pole. I thought it worked. It was a little too quick though. I think Han and Chewie became friends too quickly. However, my opinion might be skewed just because I like the Legends introduction of how Han saves Chewie from enslavement. So I guess that sort of segues into another criticism I have. The pacing seemed a little odd. Things were happening too quickly. In some instances, there was character development, but in other instances, there was a lack of character development. And I think if they spent a little more time fleshing things out, it would help the pacing, it would help the characters, and it would help a lot of things. For instance, I thought the train heist was gonna happen later in the movie. I kind of thought that Han would do a string of heists with Beckett to sort of prove his merit, and that the big heist was going to be the train robbery. But it was like as soon as Han deserts the Empire and rolls with Beckett, that's their first job. That was a big job to be Han's first job. That leads to another thing. The monkey guy, I don't remember his name, and Val, they were part of Beckett's crew, and there was almost no development for them. Sure, the monkey guy was like cracking jokes. It's one of those things things that's sort of a trope in movies. Look how funny and outgoing I am. I hope I don't get killed off. And that's what it sort of felt like. I've seen that in plenty other movies where they have like this goofball character and then they kill him off and you're supposed to feel sorry. And I think that's what they did. They're like, oh, look at this cute monkey with a funny sense of humor, and then they kill him. And then Val, Beckett's woman, whatever she was, I don't know if it was wife, girlfriend, what the case was, she's killed off too. They were killed off so early, and sure, they show their makeshift graves, but Beckett almost has no reaction. He punches Han in the face, which is completely understandable, but it seemed as if Beckett was more mad about the heist going bad than losing his crew, especially his girlfriend. His girlfriend died. He didn't even mention it. Even if he had like one little line of dialogue that said something like, you screwed this heist up and because of that my friends are dead, my girlfriend's dead. But he didn't even mention their deaths. It just shows their graves and then he punches Han. It just seemed like they skipped over their deaths pretty quickly. So that leads us to Dryden Vos. I thought he was a pretty good character. He was certifiably batshit insane, and I liked him for that reason. Paul Bettany has been in a couple other movies that I like. He was so just loosey-goosey. One minute like, oh, I'm so sorry to hear what happened, but I'm afraid I have no choice but to kill you. And the fact that he could go from one to the other so quickly proves how fucking crazy he was. So I thought he was a pretty good villain, but at the same time, we really didn't see a lot of him, and that may be a result of the fact that he was cast so late in the game, but I did like his character. I like that he had a trophy room. That sort of reminds me of another callback to Legends. In the first Han Solo novel, Han worked for this guy named Teroenza, and it was basically this rhino alien with little arms, and he was a collector of artifacts, so he had an artifact room as well. I don't know if they pulled that specifically from Legends, sort of like a little nod to that book or not, but I did like that. Of course, there was the Mandalorian armor in the background. I did like his yacht. It was just this gathering of people. Beckett said to Han, listen, keep your head down. These guys are not your friends. Sort of reminds me, I guess, of the Canto Bight scene in The Last Jedi, that it's all these big wigs and like they act like so sophisticated and stuff, but deep down they're sort of scummy criminals. More so in this, that these characters, you don't know what their past is and you don't want to know. You don't want to get close to them. The fact that Qi'ra was there, it should have been surprising, but I saw in the trailers that she was there, so that sort of ruined it. It kind of hurt me a little bit that Qi'ra was working for Dryden and you weren't really sure what her role was. It kind of seemed like she was his slave. They sort of hinted at that. Then later on when they're on the Falcon together, Han is still alluding to the fact that he's in love with her. She says something along the lines of, I don't know if you still would be if you knew what I've done. And he says, I don't care. And the fact that this girl that he cared about so much is sort of with this other guy doing seedy things, it was sort of upsetting. So I guess the next thing to talk about is Lando. I think Donald Glover did a great job. I think he looked great. The fact that he was like really into fashion, they sort of made it a comedy thing. Lando in the original trilogy, he was so suave and he was just cool, you know? They tried to do that with young Lando, and for the most part, it succeeded. He had that suave, cool demeanor, but at the same time, they sort of made him comic relief at times. When he was sitting on the Falcon in Kessel and he was like, Lando Calrissian Diaries Entry 7, or whatever he says. I thought that was kind of goofy. A little too many jokes surrounding Lando and his appearance, but honestly, I love Donald Glover as Lando. Another minor complaint though, I felt like he was sort of putting on a voice. It seemed like he was trying too hard to try to imitate Billy D. Williams. I couldn't pinpoint it exactly, but there was something awkward about the way he talked. I think Han and Lando had a very interesting dynamic. They liked each other and they were sort of friendly, but at the same time, they had this competition going on. But I guess that's how their relationship starts, is with the game of Sabacc. So the fact that Han lost the first card game actually surprised me. That was the big scene where he was gonna win the Falcon, but then you find out that Lando's a filthy cheater and he's got that thing on his wrist. Later on in the movie, when they double back and Han hugs him and swipes the card off of him, I thought that was interesting. So now I guess I want to talk about L3. There were some novels released before the movie came out. I remember hearing that L3 was sort of this droid liberator, and there were a lot of people complaining SJWs have infiltrated Star Wars, and it was like because of L3 and the fact that she wanted to give droids freedom. I thought that was pretty ridiculous when I heard it. It totally makes sense in the world of Star Wars. I've seen A New Hope, numerous times, and it wasn't that recently. I was watching the cantina scene when the bartender says, "Hey, you're droids. We don't serve their kind." I said to my brother, Why can't R2 and 3PO come in the bar? What's it gonna hurt? There's a really great video out there. Hello Greedo, he's a Star Wars YouTuber, one of my favorites. He did a video called Star Wars and Politics. He not only addresses the L3 thing, but he also mentions that scene in A New Hope. And he also mentions how in the prequels, there was a lot of parallels to the Bush presidency. And it's a great video, I highly recommend it. I mean, it makes sense to me. You see these droids and they have restraining bolts on them, and L3 wants to liberate them. I thought it added to the story, and it made the Kessel scene even more entertaining. Maybe a little over the top, but I thought it was great. I have no problems with L3. She had a lot of pride in herself, and she was sort of mouthy. She had a great dynamic with Lando, and I think the droid liberation thing kind of helped the chaotic nature of the Kessel scene. When they arrive on Kessel and they're trying to infiltrate the spice facility, things just go to shit quickly. L3 starts liberating the droids, and the droids are taking the restraining bolts off one another, and they show like the gonk droid like stepping on the control panel. It was like a fun sense of chaos. The droids were being liberated, the slaves were being liberated, all the while they were trying to do this operation that was super risky to begin with. But of course, at the end of the Kessel scene, we see L3's death. The fact that Lando like ran towards her and, you know, was really passionate about her, it almost actually made you believe that he was in love with L3. I thought that was actually pretty powerful, one of the more powerful scenes in the movie. He tries to drag her body and she snaps in half and she's glitching out, and he's like, it's gonna be okay, it's gonna be okay, and then she dies. I thought that was really powerful, actually. I wasn't sure if I was going to like L3, but by that time, I actually really felt for her, and I felt for Lando for losing her. The fact that they upload her consciousness, or whatever you want to call it, to the mainframe of the Falcon, I thought was an interesting touch. And that sort of was a callback to Empire Strikes Back when they're trying to fix the hyperdrive. 3PO is communicating with the Falcon. He says something along the lines of, the Falcon has such a peculiar dialect. From now on, I'm always gonna picture 3PO talking to the Falcon, and it's sort of giving an attitude back because it's actually L3's consciousness. Something else I think I should mention were the Easter eggs and some of the mentions in the movie. So I just talked about 3PO and all of that shit. Another one was the fact that Beckett, his disguise on Kessel was the mask that Lando wore in the beginning of Return of the Jedi. There were probably more Easter eggs than I'm aware of, but there were a lot of mentions I noticed. At one point they say something about the planet Felucia, but then there was a big one. Lando, when he meets Beckett, he says something about like, oh, Tobias Beckett, you killed Aura Singh. Aura Singh is one of those expanded universe characters. I think she ended up being in the Clone Wars. We were in a theater that like, there's a strict no talking rule. We couldn't help it right then. We're like, oh, badass. It's mostly for like the diehard Star Wars fans who really follow everything. There was one mention though I could not believe made it into the movie, and that was when Qi'ra and L3 are in that room. It shows Qi'ra, you see the flip of her cape, and you hear a bunch of sounds, and it cuts to the window. She basically took the guy down with hand-to-hand combat, and L3 was like, wow, what's that? And she says, Terras Kasi, Dryden taught me. And the fact that Terras Kasi got a mention in this movie blows my mind. For those of you that don't know, Terras Kasi is a form of martial arts in Star Wars Legends, and I did a review of the video game Star Wars Masters of Terras Kasi on the PlayStation 1. Long story short, it's terrible, but needless to say, when they mentioned Terras Kasi, I couldn't help but chuckle out loud just for the fact that I know all about Terras Kasi. Another mention that they did in a roundabout way was Beckett talking about Jabba. He says this big shot gangster in Tatooine. When Beckett mentions it, I'm just like, oh, okay, awesome. Like maybe Han will put that in the back of his mind and consider it at some point. But I didn't really like the fact that at the end of the movie, that's where they're heading. It's like 10 years before A New Hope. I wouldn't think that Han would be working for Jabba for so long. I was just sort of thinking that there's a lot to tell between this movie and when he starts working for Jabba. Ethan and I were sort of talking about not only Easter eggs, but just small little references or chunks of the story that sort of came forth in the movie. For instance, Beckett just throws Han the DL-44 and he catches it and he looks down at it and there's a shot, sort of like an over-the-shoulder shot of him holding it. They didn't spend too much time on it, which was great. You know, I hate this thing where everything has to have an origin story. It would have been really bad if like on Beckett's deathbed he said, here, take this pistol, it's trustworthy, you know, that kind of thing. I think in some of the other past movies, like with Rogue One or The Force Awakens, they would have done a slow zoom on the pistol and had like a little musical flair reminiscent of some piece of the original soundtrack. They didn't make everything a huge deal. Ethan put it this way, there were some things that were sort of on the nose. It was borderline too much. I know one example they handled really well was the final scene with Beckett. He says something along the lines of, "Kid, you still got a lot to learn, but you're about to learn the most valuable lesson ever." And I was really hoping he wouldn't say, "Always shoot first." I was deathly afraid that he was going to say that, and then all of a sudden, bang, he has a bullet hole in him. And that honestly surprised me. And then I realized Han didn't let him finish the sentence. Han shot first. It could have been so bad. If Beckett would have said, "Always shoot first," it would have ruined it. But the fact that Han just, boom, did it, made it great. Beckett was sort of a mentor in a way. It was a very strange relationship because he ends up double-crossing Han, which all the double-crossing that happened, I pretty much predicted. I like the fact that Beckett was sort of giving out all this life advice to Han. Don't trust these people. If you go with me, you're in this life for good. And of course there was the line, and I'm not going to quote it exactly, but never trust anyone, always assume they will betray you. I figured that was just foreshadowing, and he was like, "Hey, you didn't listen to me, kid. Always be on the lookout." Sort of reminds you of like a grouchy grandfather that is like giving you advice but also sort of criticizing everything you do at the same time. Learn by example, but if you mess up, I'm gonna criticize the shit out of you. But also his allegiance changed like that. The fact that he was like, "Oh shit, f you Dryden, I'm taking this hyperspace fuel with me. See ya." Towards the end, it sort of got like confusing because it's like, who's betraying who? Oh, everybody's betraying everybody. It was kind of good for that reason. It kept you guessing. You weren't exactly sure what was happening. But what I'm trying to say is Beckett and Han's relationship was definitely unique. Even after shooting Beckett straight in the chest, he falls down. Han goes to like confront him. And he said, "Hey, I was always gonna play that instrument," whatever he mentions. He's like, I knew you were, buddy." It was like they were back on good terms now that he was dying. But I can't say that I didn't like it. I actually really liked Woody Harrelson's character in this. He was sort of like a father figure, but at the same time, he was an outlaw and really had no allegiance. I like that about him. So I'm not really sure how I feel about the Kessel Run. We all knew that the Kessel Run would make it into the movie. It basically has to. They come across that giant creature. Han's idea is to go towards the gravity well and to jettison the escape pod so that the creature chases it into the gravity well. They were being sucked in and Han was trying his best, and they said, "Try the hyperspace fuel," and they're like, "No, it could blow us up. What about a drop?" And they put the drop in. The Falcon, it just shuts down. Sort of reminiscent in Empire when Han tries to jump to hyperspace and it doesn't work, and it even made the same sound. It made that whoop 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 sound. I like that, but then all of a sudden it's like boom and it shoots through. I kind of like the fact that that's how the Falcon got in the condition that it's in. Han was giving her all she had, and it was tearing pieces of the Falcon off as they were trying to make their escape. One thing that sort of annoys me is that they specifically showed the satellite coming off. It was a different satellite than was in A New Hope, along with Beckett's gun. At one point, Beckett's gun is torn off, and also we got the explanation of how this pristine ship ended up looking sort of trashy. I felt like they had to explain it for the sake of the fans, the kinds of fans that need everything explained to them. I felt like that was the movie saying, "Oh, well, that's why he has a different satellite dish in A New Hope. That's why he has quad barrel laser cannons in A New Hope. That's why he doesn't have the front closed off in A New Hope." Felt like it was the movie sort of pandering to the most annoying Star Wars fan audience, the kinds of people that just ask too many questions, the same kinds of people that came up with all these Snoke theories, those types of annoying Star Wars fans. As a whole, I'm not sure if I like the Kessel Run. It's so legendary for Han Solo's story. That's the Falcon's claim to fame. It made the Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs. The stakes were definitely high and they tried something risky. I don't know if it lived up to the hype of being like, oh, this is the Kessel Run. I also did like the fact that they finally land and Lando is staring at a ship and it just looks like a wreck. Han flies the ship once and that's the result. It just looks absolutely awful. But Lando's standing there staring at his ship and it's just in complete disarray. And he's like, "I hate you. I never want to see you again." And I forget when, but Han says something along the lines of, "Hey, we made the Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs. Well, if you round down." I thought that was a pretty sly Han move. The fact that maybe it isn't 12 parsecs. So I guess now I'll mention Enfys Nest and her swoop bike gang. I've heard that the concept of the swoop bike gang is something from Legends. I always love it when they pull from Legends and introduce it into the new canon. I follow a bunch of different Star Wars pages on Facebook. So before the movie came out, there were all these articles that kept popping up in my feed. But one of the articles hinted that Enfys Nest might be a female. So when they said at the beginning of the movie, like he and him and things like that, I was like, oh, okay, well, I guess that was just a rumor. But when they finally came face to face with Beckett and Han, it kept zooming in on her helmet. I was like, okay, here it is. The big reveal, she's a woman. Those articles are right. However, I didn't expect her to be so young. I wish I hadn't seen that, so it would have been more of a surprise to me. When they started explaining stuff in that scene, you sort of got lost for a second. Whose tongues were cut out? What are they talking about exactly? At that part, it definitely slowed down, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I just need to watch it again to fully grasp the story. I was surprised that Han was so eager to help them. I think that's because the Han in A New Hope, he wasn't willing to do anything unless money was involved. But they were also going with the theme of him being a good guy, so I think that's why they did it. Han in A New Hope is arrogant and self-centered. Han in Solo, he's definitely arrogant, but he's young and eager, and I guess maybe he hasn't gotten his pessimistic outlook just yet. Maybe more of Enfys Nest? I would have liked to see more of Enfys Nest to establish, hey, there's this rivalry between Beckett and then their gang. Enfys Nest has a really cool character design, like the helmet and the staff thing, and it's like really tribal, so I would have liked to see more of that. I guess something I really haven't talked about too much is Qi'ra's character. I liked her in the beginning of the movie, but as the movie progressed, there was a lot of hints that she's done some sketchy things, and her allegiance to Han wasn't as strong as it was before he left Corellia. By the end of the movie, when she double crosses him, it wasn't surprising. You go ahead, go save Chewie, I'll stay here. Like immediately, I was like, okay, well, she's not gonna get the jewels so they can sell him like Han wants her to, which is also a little bit from the first Han Solo novel. That's actually how, spoiler alert for that novel, that's how Han gets away. He steals the artifacts from Terrawenza, who was like this guy he worked for. They sell his artifacts so him and this girl that Han had fallen in love with can escape, but it doesn't really pan out. Anyway, back to the movie. As soon as he said, we'll get the jewels, we'll sell them, whatever, I knew she was gonna double cross him. So that leads me to a list of criticisms I have. I already mentioned that I thought the pacing was off. I also thought it was going to be a bigger movie. I thought it was going to take place over a longer period of time. Like a jump to 3 years later, I was hoping it would continue to do that. He joined up with Beckett. I was hoping there would be a multiple amount of heists, and it would sort of span over like a couple months time or like a year's time, and then the train heist would be the ultimate heist that he has to do, and then it goes wrong and they get into more trouble. And then I was hoping like maybe the Kessel Run was later on, like several months after that or whatever. Like I thought there were going to be significant time jumps. I think that would have told a better story rather than Han had this one big adventure all at once where he met up with Beckett, tried to rob a train, almost got killed by Dryden Vos, went to Kessel, did the Kessel Run, came back, killed Beckett, got betrayed by Qi'ra. It was all in the span of a few days or whatever. I felt it would have been more powerful if it was over a couple years or something. To jump back to things I did like, I liked that Warwick Davis was in this and he shows his face. He's been in a ton of Star Wars movies playing random roles, random creatures. This is the second time he's shown his face in a Star Wars movie. He was in episode 1. He was sitting next to Watto during the pod race scene. It's always nice to see Warwick Davis in a Star Wars movie. It's become tradition at this point, but I'm glad that they showed his face again. Another thing that they did was there was a character in Rogue One that was one of Saw Gerrera's guerrilla fighters, I believe, that was actually part of Enfys Nest's gang in this. I thought that was pretty cool that they included like another secondary, very secondary Star Wars character from Rogue One in this. Also, the troopers that were on the train, it was very reminiscent of the tank pilot in Rogue One. So I like that they're keeping the continuity between the Star Wars stories. All right, so back to my criticisms. I saved this for last because this is my biggest criticism of the movie. One that almost completely ruined it for me. I think you guys know what's coming up, and I apologize if you're a fan of this. The cameo with Darth Maul. I just thought it was awful. I thought it was awful. Why is that necessary? Qi'ra uses Dryden's ring to activate some sort of panel and like the shades go down and all of a sudden this hologram comes up. First thought I had was, is this the Emperor? But then you hear the voice and you're like, okay, well that's not the Emperor. Then they start to show a little more and more of the hologram and it's like, who is this? Who's this person that they're talking to? And then when they finally show it, it's Darth Maul. What does he have to do with the Crimson Dawn or whatever they're called? Let's take it from the point of view of a Star Wars fan fan who has only seen the movies. You know the timeline. You know that it's after the prequels, but before the original trilogy. You see that Darth Maul's in it, and you're like, well, wait, isn't he dead by this point? And that's sort of how I saw it. However, my filter was that I knew that he came back in Clone Wars and in Rebels, I just haven't seen those shows. So here's a second viewpoint. My buddy Ethan, he's watched all of Clone Wars and he's watched all of Rebels. But I asked him, I was like, okay, so in the context of Rebels and Clone Wars, does this appearance really make sense to you? And he thought about it and he's like, I really don't think so. The YouTuber Star Wars Explained made a video. I haven't watched it yet just for the fact that I wanted to convey my confusion in my review, but he made a video explaining Maul's cameo in Solo. So that's a video that I definitely need to watch so I fully understand it. But other than the fact that I feel he should have been killed off in A Phantom Menace, even if you're going to do that, there has to be some context as to why he's in this movie. To me, it was just like, hey guys, remember Darth Maul? Here he is. Are you guys happy? What do you think, nerds? I also see it as a setup for sequels. We're gonna introduce him in this movie and he's gonna have a bigger part in some other Star Wars movie. And that's sort of like the Marvel syndrome that I just absolutely hate. To wrap it up, the Darth Maul scene almost ruined it for me. I just hated it. Hey guys, sorry to interrupt, but I'm in the very late stages of editing this and I realized this segment was just way too long. The video is already long enough as it is. So what I did was take a ton of content from this segment and I'm actually making it into another video. So there's going to be a whole other video of my extended rant on the Darth Maul cameo, and I also go off on a tangent talking about sequels, and I'll just release that within a day or two. Anyway, sorry to interrupt, back to the review. So I guess to wrap things up, I'll say that when I first heard they were making a Han Solo film, I had my doubts. I thought that's the worst idea ever. However, after seeing this, I think Alden Ehrenreich did his damnedest to portray Han Solo the best way he could. I thought Donald Glover was great as Lando. They had an interesting chemistry. I think Woody Harrelson was pretty great. L3 was great. As a whole, great movie. I really enjoyed it. I'm gonna have to watch it a second time to fully form my opinions on it. Just right now, to me, it feels as if it's sort of like a summer blockbuster action movie that is like maybe a sequel to another action movie, you know what I mean? It left some things to be desired, I suppose. I felt like it didn't do anything new, but I'm not gonna discredit it entirely. But of course, tell me what you guys thought. I'd love to discuss it with you in the comments, so drop me a line and we'll talk about it. But definitely check out the teaser trailer parody that I'm working on. That should be out in a few days. I hope you guys stick around to watch that. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. May the Force be with you.